Hello and welcome. Today we are going to talk to you about a very important topic, why Allah encourages you to be alone. From an Islamic perspective, we will explore the place of solitude and contemplation in human life and its effects on our spiritual and mental health. Drawing from our holy book, the Holy Quran, and the Hadiths of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we will explore the wisdom of being alone and how we can gain spiritual strength in the process. If you are ready, let's get started. 1. The importance and wisdom of solitude in Islam. Solitude and contemplation in the Quran. Islam often emphasizes the importance of solitude and contemplation. In many verses, the Holy Quran encourages contemplation, that is, reflection. In this context, solitude is seen as an opportunity to strengthen one's bond with Allah and to realize that the life of this world is temporary. For example, the Quran states, "Is it not time for the hearts of those who believe to soften with reverence at the remembrance of Allah and of the revelation that has come down in truth? Let them not be like those who were given the book before, but their hearts hardened after a long time had passed." This verse emphasizes the importance of contemplation and solitude to internalize Allah's message. Solitude supports the spiritual development of the individual and helps soften the heart. Solitude in the life of the Prophet. Before receiving revelation, the Prophet Muhammad would often ascend Mount Hira, where he would be alone and contemplate. This was part of his spiritual quest and spiritual growth. His solitude in the cave of Hira is an indication of his deep connection with God and his preparation to receive revelation. While we sleep comfortably at night in our own homes, oppression is happening somewhere. I invite you to write "Free Palestine" in the comment section below to raise our voice against this oppression. Now, let's continue where we left off, my brothers. This example of the Prophet shows the importance of solitude and contemplation, solitude and spiritual cleansing. Solitude helps to purify oneself spiritually. In the chaos and intensity of modern life, it is necessary to be alone with oneself, to find inner peace, and to perform a spiritual cleansing. Islam encourages solitude to achieve this spiritual cleansing. In this context, solitude helps to discipline one's nafs, reduce one's attachment to worldly possessions, and increase one's submission to Allah. Solitude in prayer and worship. Solitude allows prayer and worship to be more sincere and deeper. When people are alone, they can pray more sincerely and earnestly and get closer to Allah. In one of his hadiths, the Prophet said, "The best of you among people is the one who fears Allah the most while praying." Bukhari. This hadith emphasizes the sincerity and depth of worship when alone, the role of solitude in the modern world. In today's world, with the impact of technology and social media, people are in a constant state of communication and interaction. However, this can disrupt one's inner peace and spiritual balance. Islam reminds us of the importance of solitude and contemplation, even in this modern chaos. Solitude is an opportunity to re-examine one's spiritual values and strengthen one's devotion to Allah. Solitude and patience. Solitude is also a sign of patience and fortitude. Islam regards patience and fortitude as important virtues. In this process, the lonely person learns patience, increases his inner resilience, and becomes spiritually stronger. The Quran states, "Be patient, for Allah is with the patient." 2. Loneliness in the life of the Prophet. Hira cave and the first revelation. Before receiving revelation, the Prophet Muhammad would often ascend Mount Hira, where he would be alone and contemplate. This was part of his spiritual quest and spiritual growth. His solitude in the cave of Hira is an indication of his deep connection with Allah and his preparation to receive revelation. The lonely times he spent in the cave of Hira were the culmination of the Prophet's spiritual quest. During the time he spent there, he distanced himself from worldly affairs and devoted himself entirely to spiritual thoughts and strengthening his bond with Allah. The first revelation came in this cave while he was alone in contemplation. This process, which began with Gabriel's command to read, marked the beginning of the birth of Islam. Spiritual search and preparation. The Prophet's solitude in the cave of Hira is of great importance in terms of his spiritual maturation and preparation for his prophetic mission. This process was instrumental in strengthening him mentally and spiritually and reinforcing his submission and faith in Allah. These times of solitude helped the Prophet to find inner peace and a deeper connection with God. Withdrawal from society and inner peace. The Prophet's preference to withdraw from society and remain alone enabled him to be alone with Allah, away from the affairs of the world and the chaos of daily life. This process helped him find inner peace, maintain his spiritual balance, and focus better on Allah's commands. The Prophet's tradition of contemplation. The Prophet's tradition of solitude and contemplation is an important example for Muslims. His behavior reminds us of the importance of solitude and contemplation in our spiritual life. This lesson from the life of the Prophet encourages us to get away from the chaos of worldly affairs and to establish a closer bond with Allah. Solitude and patience in difficult times. The Prophet also learned patience and fortitude when he was alone. During the difficulties and hardships of the Meccan period, being alone and taking refuge in Allah increased his patience and resilience. In this process, solitude taught the Prophet patience and fortitude and made him spiritually stronger. The spiritual power of solitude. The examples of solitude in the Prophet's life illustrate the spiritual power of solitude and contemplation. These times of solitude helped to strengthen the Prophet spiritually, strengthen his bond with God, and prepare him for his prophetic mission. His example reminds us of the importance and power of solitude and contemplation in our spiritual lives. 3. Solitude and spiritual cleansing. The importance of spiritual purification. Islam places great importance on spiritual cleansing and purification. In this context, being alone helps to purify oneself spiritually. In the chaos and intensity of modern life, it is necessary to be alone with oneself, to find inner peace and to perform a spiritual cleansing. Solitude allows people to return to their inner world and to discipline their nafs. Self-training and solitude. In Islam, the nafs is seen as one of the greatest enemies of man. Solitude is an opportunity to discipline one's nafs. When one is alone, one can reduce one's attachment to worldly goods and temporary desires and become more resistant to the desires of the nafs. In this process, loneliness helps one to know oneself better and to mature spiritually. The Quran states, "Whoever hopes to meet his Lord, let him do righteous deeds and associate nothing in the worship of his Lord." This verse emphasizes the importance of righteous deeds and submission to Allah. Solitude allows a person to do these good deeds and to strengthen his submission to Allah. Inner peace and spiritual balance. Solitude is also important for finding inner peace and maintaining spiritual balance. Being alone, away from the stresses and anxieties of daily life, helps a person to find inner peace again. This process is an opportunity to maintain spiritual balance and increase devotion to God. Solitude helps to maintain one's mental and spiritual health, renew oneself, and establish a deeper spiritual connection. Solitude and inner reckoning. When one is alone, one confronts one's inner world. This is an opportunity for the individual to evaluate himself, see his mistakes and shortcomings, and take steps to correct them. Inner reckoning is an important step for spiritual development. Solitude encourages this inner reckoning and self-renewal, spiritual cleansing and repentance. Solitude also provides a favorable environment for repentance and asking God's forgiveness. Repentance is an important part of spiritual cleansing. When one is alone, one can reflect more deeply on one's sins and mistakes, feel remorse, and ask Allah for forgiveness. This process is of great importance for spiritual purification and getting closer to Allah. Distancing from the world and focusing on the hereafter solitude helps people realize that the life of this world is temporary and helps them focus on the hereafter. Being alone, away from the world's temporary desires and material attachments, increases one's thoughts and preparations for the hereafter. This process enriches one's spiritual life and strengthens one's devotion to Allah. 4. Solitude in prayer and worship. The contribution of solitude to prayer and worship. Solitude allows prayer and worship to be more sincere and deeper. When one is alone, one can pray more sincerely and earnestly and draw closer to Allah. Solitude helps to establish a more intimate connection between oneself and God. In this process, prayer and worship become a more intense spiritual experience. The Prophet and solitary worship. The Prophet Muhammad would often be alone during night prayers and times of contemplation. These times of solitude strengthened his devotion and faith in Allah. Being alone during night prayers helped the Prophet to find inner peace and spiritual strength. This practice is an important example for Muslims. Sincerity and sincerity. Prayers and acts of worship are more intense in terms of sincerity and sincerity when one is alone. When one is alone with Allah, away from the eyes of others, one can pray more sincerely and earnestly. This sincerity increases the likelihood of the prayer being accepted and reinforces one's spiritual peace. Silence and attention. Solitude increases silence and attention in prayer and worship. In the noise and chaos of the modern world, being alone allows one to better focus on one's worship. Silence helps deepen prayer and worship and increase one's devotion to God. This process provides spiritual purification and peace. Night worship and solitude. The Quran places great importance on night prayers. Night prayers allow a person to turn to Allah alone in a quiet and peaceful environment. It is an opportunity to grow spiritually stronger and to get closer to Allah. The Quran states, "Arise in part of the night and recite the Quran as a special supererogatory recitation for you, lest your Lord raise you to a praised station." This verse emphasizes the importance of night worship and the value of doing it in solitude. Inner renewal and spiritual strength. Solitude allows prayer and worship to bring inner renewal and spiritual strength. When alone, a person turns to God and finds inner peace. This process helps him to become spiritually stronger and more resilient to the challenges of daily life. Solitude becomes an important means of spiritual cleansing and purification through prayer and worship. The spiritual discipline of solitude. Being alone increases one's spiritual discipline. Being alone regularly and spending this time in prayer and worship organizes and disciplines one's spiritual life. This process helps to strengthen one's devotion and faith in God. Solitude plays an important role as a means of spiritual education and discipline. 5. The role of solitude in the modern world. Impact of technology and social media. In today's world, with the impact of technology and social media, people are in a constant state of communication and interaction. Smartphones, computers, and social media platforms keep people in touch with each other at all times. However, this constant state of communication can disrupt one's inner peace and spiritual balance. Constant notifications, messages, and social media streams can prevent people from being alone with their own thoughts, loneliness, and inner peace. Islam reminds us of the importance of solitude and contemplation, even in this modern chaos. Solitude is an opportunity to reassess one's spiritual values and strengthen one's devotion to Allah. The stresses and anxieties of the modern world can upset one's spiritual balance. Being alone helps a person find inner peace by getting away from these stresses and anxieties. The Quran states, they remember Allah while they are standing, sitting, lying on their sides, and ponder over the creation of the heavens and the earth. This verse emphasizes the importance of remembering and contemplating Allah. Being alone, away from the noise and chaos of the modern world, makes this contemplation more meaningful. Inner serenity and mental health. Solitude is also important for maintaining mental health and inner serenity. The fast pace and ever-changing dynamics of the modern world can negatively affect one's mental health. Being alone helps a person to mentally rest, organize their thoughts, and cope with stress. This process is of great importance for maintaining mental health and inner serenity. Rediscovering spiritual values. Solitude is an opportunity to rediscover one's spiritual values. The materialistic nature of the modern world can cause people to forget their spiritual values and become more attached to worldly possessions. Being alone helps people to get away from this materialistic structure, rediscover their spiritual values, and reinforce their devotion to Allah. Meditation and contemplation. In the modern world, many people turn to meditation and similar practices to cope with stress. In Islam, contemplation similar to these meditation practices helps one to find inner peace and become spiritually stronger. Contemplation means being alone and reflecting on Allah's creation. This process increases spiritual peace and serenity, social isolation and spiritual bonding. Loneliness should not be perceived as social isolation. Islam encourages social relationships and living in community. However, it is important to be alone and contemplate from time to time to strengthen one's spiritual bonds. These times of solitude help to make social life and relationships more meaningful. Escape from the noise of the modern world. The modern world is filled with a constant flow of information and noise. This noise can disturb one's spiritual peace and weaken one's devotion to God. Being alone, away from this noise, helps a person to regain spiritual balance and strengthen their devotion to Allah. Solitude plays an important role as a spiritual escape and a process of regrouping. 6. Solitude and patience. The role of solitude in teaching. Patience. Solitude is also a sign of patience and fortitude. Islam regards patience and fortitude as important virtues. In this process, the lonely person learns patience, increases his/her inner resilience, and becomes spiritually stronger. Solitude helps the individual to discipline his/her ego and become more resilient against difficulties. The Quran states, "Be patient, for Allah is with the patient." This verse emphasizes the importance of patience and that Allah is with the patient. Solitude provides an opportunity to develop the virtue of patience. The Prophet and patience. Our Prophet Muhammad faced many difficulties throughout his life and showed patience against these difficulties. His patience and fortitude is an important example for Muslims. The times when the Prophet was alone increased his patience and inner strength. These moments of solitude strengthened his spiritual resilience. Patience and spiritual strengthening. Loneliness helps to strengthen a person spiritually. When faced with difficulties, the lonely person seeks refuge in Allah and draws strength from Him. In this process, patience and fortitude increase one's spiritual strength and reinforce one's devotion to Allah. Solitude is an important means of learning patience and gaining spiritual strength. Solitude and self-training. Patience is also important for the discipline of the nafs. When one is alone, one becomes more resistant to the desires of the nafs. Controlling the desires of the nafs requires patience. Solitude facilitates this process and helps one to discipline the nafs. This process is part of spiritual maturation, patience and inner peace. Solitude is important for learning patience as well as for finding inner peace. The stresses and anxieties of the modern world can disturb one's inner peace. Being alone helps one to get away from these stresses and anxieties and to find inner peace again. Patience is the key to maintaining this peace and spiritual balance. Patience and tawakkul. In Islam, patience is associated with tawakkul. Tawakkul means trusting in Allah and knowing that everything is under His control. Solitude is an opportunity to learn patience and tawakkul. When faced with difficulties, the lonely person puts his trust in Allah and asks for His help. This process builds spiritual strength and trust in Allah. What loneliness teaches. Loneliness teaches many lessons. Patience is one of them. The lonely person learns patience, manages to cope with difficulties, and finds inner peace. This process is part of spiritual development and maturation. Solitude makes a person more resilient, patient, and spiritually strong.